finding clean energy from nature? The answer is blowing in the wind. Wind power, a literally huge industry, both in scale and its facilities. Everything about wind turbines is huge. Let me give you an idea. One of these nacelles behind me weighs as much as an adult blue whale. And a wind turbine from top to bottom can be as tall as 240 meters high. That's the same height as the CCTV headquarter building. And with each sweep of the wind turbine blade, the area size is the size of the Sydney Opera House. And do you know how much power that one sweep would generate? Enough to power an electric car for 30 kilometers. And Vestas is the world's biggest in this giant industry. The Danish company installed China's earliest wind turbines back in 1986 and launched its largest production base for wind power equipment in the mid-2000s.
Our Tianjin factory is the largest setup we have in the world. It provides the most of our markets with turbines on both 2 megawatt and 4 megawatt platform. The factory was established from 2005 onwards, and with the 4 factories we have here, it's the only place in the world where we actually have the full supply chain for a turbine present here. The factories are very close to our suppliers. It gives us a lot of speed and a lot of agility to follow the market trends, no matter where we are. Also, of course, we need to have a China factory to supply for China market.
And the China factory is not only supplying the China market, but also other regions.
Vestas Tianjin manufacturing complex actually is including 4 factories, and blade factory, and nacelle assembly factory, generator factory, and the converter factory. And we have a total area about 400,000 square meters, producing a full range of 2 megawatt and 4 megawatt platform. And more than 50% of 2 megawatt platform products are sold to China. And the rest we ship to Mediterranean region. And for the 4 megawatt platform product, currently our main market, Mediterranean region, and also North Central Europe.
China is a colossal market for wind power. Its cumulative installed capacity totaled nearly 217,000 megawatts in 2018, more than twice the level of the US in second place. And it's still growing fast, with its new installed capacity topping the world at 23,000 megawatts, nearly 3 times that of the US, the runner-up. Despite foreign players' long-term presence and active push in China, the country's wind power market is dominated by local players. Even though you are the largest foreign OEM for wind turbines in China, overall foreign OEMs only make up 5% of this very large market. Do you think that will change in the short term?
I don't think it will change in the short term. In reality, there is a certain history, there is a certain way of doing very closely with domestic OEMs in China. That has served China quite well, but I also think when we are now moving into a new tariff and a new grid parity system, that probably forces people to look more, not necessarily only on the initial investment into the turbine, but what is actually the total cost of ownership of the turbine and therefore the power plant of its expected lifetime, which is 20 years. We are still in China a very large manufacturer of turbines, a very large manufacturer also of assets to the wind industry globally. But the truth of it is still in 2019 and also in 2020 will be net exporter of turbines out of China, which of course to some extent it hurts a little bit my pride, but I am also realistic in saying it doesn't change overnight.
China's production advantage turned complicated for wind turbine makers in 2018 when the China-US trade war started. That meant tariffs on Vestas exports from China. The US is Vestas' biggest market. These Tianjin factories contribute about 60% of Vestas' global output. But with the China-US trade war posing serious challenges to the global supply chain, how is the company dealing with them head-on?
If we see as a global supply chain today, the way we deal with global supply chain, we plan for it. We always have a planning process and a time horizon that typically runs 6 to 12 months. Challenge with this one is that it has changed over time. My COO that is responsible for supply chain, I think the first thing he checks in the morning is not the weather forecast. It's actually the tweet from the US, and also to some extent seeing how the tweet is not only hitting the US-China trade relation, but it is also the ripple effect, because it now goes into other countries that are typically in Southeast Asia, where it becomes Vietnam, it becomes India, so therefore suddenly it hits other parts of the supply chain. So for us, the initial reaction is it will put a lot of pressure on our earnings, because you will have to reroute. That means increased transportation costs. The whole global supply chain has been hit, not only as a Vestas phenomenon, but also as much hitting other parts of the industry. And that means every global industry player have seen some of the same effects to the supply chain.
So having said that, how are you going to adjust your production plans going forward if China becomes more heavily tariffed?
What we have done here is we are not going to move things out of China. What we have done here is we have then still used China as part of it. Then we probably reroute some of that to either other parts of our orders in Asia and other parts of Europe. And then we will take advantage of that we have other localized manufacturing facilities around in Europe and also in Americas up and running.
Longer term, manufacturing wind turbines in areas with less costly labour makes sense, but the decision needs to be balanced with consideration for expensive transport costs. Production costs are fairly high in Europe and compared with Asia Pacific especially, so will that migration continue?
You might be right that there are parts of it that are cheaper in certain countries to manufacture, but then when you add your transportation costs on either the ships or the railway, then you suddenly have a full loaded costing of the assets. And to some extent, sometimes it's cheaper to have it manufacturing closer to where it's going to be put up. And if we look at, for instance, US, or we look at Brazil, we look at Australia and others, there is still an argument of that you have to see how much you can produce locally to avoid having almost a prohibitive high transportation cost of our assets. The global industry has become truly global. There are now more countries than ever that invest in renewable energy, and some of that means that there will be people that loses their job in a certain geography, but then we put other employees in another geography. That has not to do with cost out or cost reduction, but it simply is that we can't manufacture everything in one country and then ship it around. It's simply too big an industry, and the assets are too big to ship them around. The whole industry has more or less in the last 3 years moved to an auction-based, very close to what we call grid parity or merchant market.
The newly upgraded CGTN website offers optimized coverage of China and international affairs, as well as distinct voices from around the globe. Be the first to know the biggest political news and discover the background to the major decisions. Decode China with a different perspective and get a better understanding of how China sees the world. Go beyond the news with sharp opinions on the events shaping today's world and reveal a China you have never seen before. Listen to entrepreneurs for in-depth analysis of the economy and touch the pulse of new technology via our hands-on videos. Travel back in time with CGTN to learn about China's past and immerse yourself in Chinese culture to discover the stories behind Kung Fu. Get the latest news on Chinese lifestyle, including travel, sports, and nature. Regular productions including Ask China put high-ranking officials on the spot, while C-Lab presents new ways of storytelling via cutting-edge technologies, and Global Stringer delivers unique videos from China and beyond. Take a look at the world from a different angle. See the difference.
Trade aside, the other macro factor hanging over the industry is subsidies, which the US is phasing out in line with the global trend, as renewables show they can compete without government handouts. For now, it means Vestas' order books are extra full. We're seeing record orders for Vestas, and as companies race to beat the subsidy deadline. So how are you placed to take advantage of that strong demand and stable pricing?
I think our order backlog tells probably the true story of that.
Is that 31 billion euros?
31 billion euros by end of first half this year. And we are still doing very well in that sense. But it also illustrates a little bit the challenge for the industry, because we have had to scale for 30 to 40% more demand on the asset side. And at the same time, we also have to cope with then changes to the supply chain. In any industry I know of for my whole life, that in itself is a super difficult challenge to be thrown at. But at the same time, I'm still sitting here and smiling, because it's also an enormous positive challenge to have, that we have to scale to something that is going to even more volume and even more in favor in the years to come.
China is also gradually phasing out subsidies for onshore wind projects that will go by the end of 2020. How will this affect the industry, long known for reliance on government aid and leading to boom-bust scenarios?
Subsidies is always a bit of a challenged word, because subsidies can be, are you subsidizing the individual projects? Are you subsidizing with a feed-in tariffs? Or you're subsidizing with a production tax credit, like in the US. I think generally the whole industry has more or less in the last 3 years moved to an auction-based, very close to what we call grid parity or merchant market, which also shows that the industry is now at the level where it can. The technology drive, the investment into the industry is strong enough in itself to remain and become even more efficient over time.
In markets where you have heavy subsidy, when you then change into zero subsidy, which we've seen globally all over the world, it will mean that the players will not have the cushion that they're normally used to dealing with. That will be survival of the fittest, and that will of course mean with a lower price, only the professional players in the market will be able to survive. With the subsidy phase out, we now expect a more mature market. We expect more professional players and a more stable way of doing business.
Wind turbines, aside from becoming bigger and taller, are also evolving through digitalization. Digitalization allows turbines to be remotely monitored and maintained. Vestas' factory in Tianjin is at the forefront of the company's digitalization drive.
Everything we do on the turbine is actually digital. All the sensors, all the way we survey, how we do the predictive, preventive maintenance. We're taking many steps towards a truly merchant market, not just globally, but also in China. And by doing that, digitalization will just be a necessity. We've done and been digital for a long time with our turbines, and this will give us an advantage also for China, where the remoteness of wind farms will have an additional dimension to that.
The company's long-term footprint in the sector gives it an edge in digitalizing its business lines.
having 42,000 wind turbines under management for many years gives us an opportunity to work with algorithms of how does those wind turbines perform under what conditions, and that's actually a digital. And that is also why we have invested in a company called Utipus in the US, where we are building some of those algorithms together. That also puts you as a customer very much in management position where you can predict how are your assets going to perform and what will your return be. So you can actually be part of increasing your return on your own assets by using some of the digital solutions in place.
As industries like automotive explore customization and modular production, wind turbine making is no different.
We started a couple of years ago to work with the modularization of our turbine. We are probably a year and a half, 2 years away from being the first turbines up. We know right now we're seeing the results of it, but until we deliver the first one to customers, there is a little bit more to go, because the supply chain has to work with the same. So in reality, as a supply chain and as a partner and as a close supplier to Vestas, you'll then be working on how you scale various components of this in different size. And that also means for us, it does sit well with the customer, because the customer could actually have special needs, could be high, low, medium wind. So if you are in a wind belt that has medium wind or low wind, you probably need a higher tower and a stronger and longer blades, and therefore we need to put that together to cope with it. So in reality, it becomes an easier design, but it becomes a lot cheaper to develop, because of course we don't need to develop a new turbine from scratch to you as a customer. No, and that's where again we can be more efficient on our usage of capex. We can again look at innovation costs becomes less over the life of individual turbines. So that's where we're aiming, at least.
As the world goes through the transition from fossil fuels to more renewables, the costs have leveled. Since 2010, wind power costs have halved and solar has dropped 85%. Energy storage can help with the natural limitations of wind and solar. Vestas and its peers have been investing into more corners of the energy sphere. Could mixed energy solutions become the way of the future?
The core of Vestas is wind, but as renewable energy prices become lower, including solar, do you think you will broaden your portfolio to include more solar, more storage?
We do that already, but also it's fair saying we don't necessarily see a lot of synergies between being an OEM or a manufacturer of wind compared to a manufacturer of solar panels. I think the real synergy in solar and wind comes when you combine the two sources of assets. Then the hybrid is in there in between, and hybrid becomes really strong when it also have a storage facility as part of it. And the storage, we are of the belief that we are only a tiny little way towards the end goal. We think the storage comes, today it's very much spoken about as battery, but we believe that this power to X, power to the next generation, probably comes through either storage in terms of traditional batteries. It comes into our cars when we start having a lot more electric cars and hybrid cars, but it probably also could come from liquids, other raw materials, where we will store some of the electricity into that. And I mean, right now, a lot of going into hydrogen and other parts, which probably then forms basis of a different part of storage in all of that hybrid between wind and solar. Not surprisingly, sun is not up all day. Surprisingly not, wind is not blowing all the time. So the combination of the two actually works really, really well in many geographies around the world. The whole electrification of everything raises the demand for electricity when we look 10, 20 years ahead. We're talking about 40% increase in demand for electricity.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Within wind, offshore is a huge growth area. It's believed to be the industry's next blue ocean. China wants to lift its offshore capacity 7 times by 2022 to 41 gigawatts. The global offshore wind market is set to quadruple over the next 8 years, according to Fortune Business Insights, a consulting firm. Vestas' joint venture with Mitsubishi Heavy Industries stands at number 2 in offshore wind market share, behind SGRE. How does Vestas see the growth potential and the outsized requirements for capital and lead time?
The offshore is now projected to have such an interesting part of the whole journey of renewable energy in the coming 20 years. Offshore is still less than 10% of what is the installed base projected for both 19 and 20. So therefore there is still quite a long way before offshore really comes to the same volume as we have seen in the onshore part.
How much potential is there for offshore?
The lead time for the industry is a lot longer. So the testing is longer, and also the development of new technology is longer and a lot more heavy in terms of CapEx. On the customer side, I will always say, yeah, but just give me that, Henrik, and it must be ready now. But in reality, the guarantee and the liability in a partnership on putting it offshore is to some extent a lot more difficult. Why is that? You also need to be aware that when you want to service or change something, it happens offshore as well.
Wind farms on the seas get stronger winds and attract less objections about noise and aesthetics.
When you are 10 kilometers adrift from shore, you will start not seeing them. So they don't have the same issues around noise permitting and others, which probably for a lot of local policymakers and also decision makers means that it becomes easier to approve some of the offshore. The cycle is that a lot of the technology drive right now goes in to build it taller, bigger, stronger, 2 to 3 times as powerful as the most powerful we have on onshore, and you don't need as many turbines to get an enormous output to be then transported grid-wise back to onshore. You don't need to assemble the turbine at sea. You can assemble it in back onshore almost in harbor, and then you can tow it out to where it needs to be positioned, and then you can have it out there. And similarly, if you want to repair some of it, it is also easier. And then you have also taking away a large part of the foundation, which is normally the costly part. Right now, one of the big drivers in offshore is that you try to work with floating foundation. This is something that has taken, for instance, the oil and gas industry quite a number of years to work out, and we have to do the same. But I think from both customers, investors, and us as OEM, there is a huge drive to try to get it to a floating platform. It's going to drive the levelized cost of energy on offshore, but then again, as I said, it takes a longer lead time than it does onshore. So we are probably talking 3 to 6 years from here.
The green drive needs to quicken. 2018 was the 4th hottest year on record. According to a report released by the International Renewables Energy Agency, if we are to avoid climate crises caused by faster global warming, the world has to increase the share of renewable energy consumption 6 times faster than the current rate.
The calls are growing for more renewable energy in the global mix, but how feasible is it to move wind to, say, 10-20% of the global mix?
It's like anything else in life, you just don't wish for it on a Friday and then wake up on a Monday and it's all done. I think in this sense we are all part of bringing that closer to actually the ambition we are setting out. I think it's also helping in many ways politicians to have a weapon at saying if we need to do this, then the renewable energy, putting renewable energy in, probably takes somewhere between 12 to 24 months to plan, where if you want to put nuclear or something else, it takes 15 to 20 years to plan. And right now, the whole electrification of everything we use, is, whether it's the building, it's the heating and ventilation, it's our transport, it just raises the demand for electricity when we look 10, 20 years ahead. And we're not talking about 2 or 3%, we're talking about 40% increase in demand for electricity, so it has to come.
In the age of sustainability practices, big companies are plugging into wind farms to reduce their carbon footprint. The business case and the environmental case for renewables are now aligned.
This is what has changed compared to 10 years ago. Now it's permanent capital allocation, and we got the pleasure of having pension funds, infrastructure funds. We got a lot of companies, if we look around the large corporations
They want to green
today,
their portfolios.
Yeah, no, and it's not, I call it sometimes you try to green things in a way where it just looks green. But today when you look at corporations on the PPA market, so it is corporate PPAs, so that means they want to make their agreement how they purchase their energy sustainable going forward. And I mean, those guys that have that, we see them. We had just done a project with IKEA globally, and they want to do part of that. We can see a lot of the IT providers, we can see Google, we can see Facebook, we can see Lego, and they all want to exactly reach to a level where they are doing the right things because it makes sense. And today I'm just saying you can invest then, even if you are not a climate believer, you can invest proper in some of the energy source at a price that doesn't increase your cost. So now you can invest and still hedge that if you're wrong, you've still done the right things for the generations to come. So that for me is a strong drive for doing the right things.
Doing the right thing means both immense opportunities and enormous pressure. Can Vestas leverage its expertise and global heft to turn headwinds into tailwinds?